I remember that night in Orinda like it was burned into my memory. A night that started with nothing more than the idea of spending Halloween with friends and ended with chaos that still echoes in my head every time I hear loud music or sudden noises. It was 2019, and Airbnb was the easiest way to find a good spot for a small get-together. My friend found this house in the hills of Orinda, California. It looked beautiful in the photos. A big modern home with a view of the bay, large windows, clean furniture, and an open backyard that overlooked the hills. It seemed perfect. The listing clearly said no parties, and the booking was supposed to be for a small group of us, just a few people hanging out, wearing costumes and watching horror movies. That was the plan. But like most plans that sound harmless at first, it didn't stay that way for long. The person who booked it told the host it was just a small family gathering, maybe 6 or 7 people tops. We didn't think too much about it. When we arrived earlier that afternoon, the neighborhood was quiet, the kind of suburban silence that feels heavy. The houses were spread apart, big driveways, trees standing between the properties, and a stillness that made even the sound of car doors closing echo. The Airbnb house sat up a small incline, and from the driveway you could see most of Orinda stretched below. The air smelled clean, like eucalyptus and cold dirt. Inside, the house was spotless. White furniture, big glass doors that opened to the deck, hardwood floors, and a long kitchen counter that looked unused. Everything felt almost too perfect. I remember standing there with my backpack, feeling like we didn't belong in a place that nice. But as the sun went down, that feeling faded. By nightfall, people started showing up. First, it was the small group we expected. Friends of friends, a couple of people from school, everyone dressed up in cheap costumes and laughing too loud. But then, around 8 or 9, more cars started arriving. Some people we didn't know, others saying they were invited by someone inside. The sound of engines and car doors multiplied. The quiet street started to fill with noise. The music inside got louder to cover it. I remember standing near the kitchen, watching the front door open and close again and again, each time a new wave of people coming in. It went from 10 people to 50 in what felt like minutes. The air inside got heavy, the kind of warmth that comes from too many bodies in one room. The music was deep, shaking the walls, and the lights from people's phones flashed like small strobe lights in the crowd. I felt uneasy, like we'd lost control of what we started. The person who booked the place looked nervous too, pacing around, checking the windows, muttering that the host would find out. By 11, there were probably close to 100 people in that house. Cars were lining both sides of the road outside, headlights occasionally sweeping through the front windows. You could feel the bass from the speakers in your chest. People were spilling out onto the deck, some into the backyard, and the driveway was packed. I remember thinking that it had gone too far, the kind of thought you have just before something breaks. Then it started to turn. The air shifted first, people arguing outside, voices rising over the music. A few small fights broke out, shoving, angry shouting, and I could feel this edge of tension cutting through the noise. It was like the entire house had changed tone in an instant. People were moving faster, talking louder, bumping into each other, some trying to leave but unable to get through the crowd. I stepped out onto the deck to get some air and looked down toward the street. There were clusters of people standing near the cars, shadows moving under the streetlights. Someone yelled, and the sound made everyone stop for a second. That moment of stillness before something terrible. Then the first shots rang out. It's strange how a sound like that cuts through everything else. 1 second there's music, laughter, shouting, and the next, it's like the air itself gets ripped apart. The first gunshot echoed up the hill, sharp and flat, followed by more. A series of quick cracks that seemed to come from the street below. Then screaming. People were running toward the house, others running away from it, confusion everywhere. Inside, the music stopped suddenly, like whoever had control of it froze. I could hear the sound of glass breaking, people yelling, heavy footsteps thundering through the hallways. Someone fell near the kitchen. Someone else ran out the back door. I remember ducking down instinctively, my heart slamming against my ribs. The air smelled like alcohol and panic. I crawled toward the corner of the living room, pressing my back against the wall, trying to listen, trying to make sense of what was happening. More shots, screams, the sound of someone crying, and then silence, broken only by distant sirens that started to build somewhere in the valley below. When I finally looked out through the sliding glass door, the backyard was littered with cups, broken bottles, and a few people crouched on the ground, trying to pull someone up. The deck was smeared with something dark. I could see the faint blue flash of police lights far down the hill, still too far to help. Every minute felt endless. It took maybe 10 minutes for the police to reach the house, but it felt like an hour. By then, most people had scattered. Some ran into the woods behind the house, others down the street toward their cars. The driveway was a mess of glass and tire tracks. The officers shouted for everyone to stay where they were, but no one could even tell what was happening anymore. I stayed where I was, near the back door, unable to move. I remember the light from a flashlight sweeping across my shoes, and an officer's hand motioning for me to come forward. Outside, it looked worse than I could have imagined. 5 people had been shot. 2 were already gone by the time help arrived. The others were being treated right there on the ground, surrounded by flashing lights and scattered debris. The smell of gunpowder mixed with the smell of spilled beer and sweat. A few people were handcuffed, others questioned, some just standing there in shock. The street was lined with police cars, their lights reflecting off the wet pavement. I remember one of the officers saying something about the house being rented through Airbnb, about how there were complaints earlier in the night from neighbors about the noise and cars. It didn't seem real. Standing there on Halloween night, surrounded by costumes and flashing red lights, with people lying motionless a few feet away. The host showed up later, crying, unable to understand how it had happened. I stood off to the side, wrapped in one of the blankets they handed out, watching as investigators took photos and placed markers where shell casings were found. The sky above Orinda was still and black. No stars visible, just the distant hum of helicopters circling overhead. I went home the next morning. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. The images kept replaying in my head. The gunfire, the screams, the smell of that house. It was supposed to be a simple get-together, something harmless. Instead, 5 people never went home. The next few days, the news was everywhere. Photos of the house, the words Airbnb party house repeated again and again. It became a story much bigger than us, a tragedy that forced Airbnb to change its rules, banning party houses altogether. Even now, years later, every Halloween feels heavier. I don't go out much on that night anymore. I can still see that house in my mind. The wide glass doors, the deck overlooking the hills, and the sound of laughter that turned to chaos. It taught me how fast things can turn, how one small lie about a small gathering can spiral into something deadly. Every detail of that night stays with me. The lights, the sound of gunfire echoing off the hills, the smell of smoke and fear. It wasn't a haunted house. There were no ghosts, but I can tell you that place is haunted by what really happened. Not by spirits, but by the weight of human carelessness, by the sound of lives ending in a house that was supposed to be safe. That night changed everything, and for me, it never really ended. I booked the Airbnb because I needed to get away from everything for a few days. My job had been wearing me down for months, and I hadn't had a proper break-in over a year. I wanted quiet, somewhere out of the city, away from people and noise. I searched for hours, scrolling through listings, until I found one that seemed perfect. It was a small guest house in the countryside, about 2 hours from where I lived. The photos showed an open field surrounded by trees, a gravel driveway, and a simple one-bedroom unit attached to a larger farmhouse. The reviews mentioned peace, privacy, and friendly owners who respected boundaries. That was all I wanted. When I arrived, it looked exactly like the photos. A long, narrow road led up to the property, with tall grass on both sides and a line of trees that seemed to go on forever. The farmhouse stood at the end of the drive, white paint peeling slightly, but neat and well-kept. The guest house was separated by a small fence with its own entrance. It looked quiet, empty, and almost too still. The host wasn't around when I got there. She had left the key in a lockbox near the door. I let myself in. Inside, it was clean but sparse. There was a small kitchen, a single couch, and a queen-sized bed in the back room. The air smelled faintly like cleaning spray and old wood. The windows looked out over the fields, which stretched into the distance. There was no sound except for the occasional hum of insects and the wind moving through the grass. It felt peaceful at first, exactly what I needed. The first night passed quietly. I unpacked, made dinner, read for a while, and went to bed early. The bed was soft, and the silence outside made it easy to sleep. When I woke up the next morning, the sun was coming through the curtains, and I felt better than I had in weeks. I made coffee and sat outside for a while, just listening to the wind and the faint rustle of leaves. It was the kind of stillness that made you forget time. Later that afternoon, I walked around the property. The host's main house sat about 100 feet away from mine, but no one seemed to be home. There was a small barn off to the side, its doors slightly open. I peeked inside and saw a few tools and some old furniture stacked up, covered with a tarp. Nothing out of place. Behind the barn was a small path that led into the woods. The reviews had mentioned it, saying it was good for short walks. I followed it for a while just to stretch my legs. The trail was narrow, covered in fallen leaves, and quiet enough that I could hear every step I took. I didn't go far, just enough to get a sense of the area, then turned back before it got dark. That night, though, something felt different. The wind had picked up, and I could hear it brushing against the sides of the house. The walls creaked now and then, which I told myself was just the old structure adjusting to the temperature. Around midnight, I woke up to a faint thud from somewhere outside. It was distant but sharp enough to pull me out of sleep. I lay there, listening, trying to figure out what it was. It didn't happen again for a while, so I eventually drifted back to sleep. The next morning, I noticed something strange. The small trash bin near the porch had been knocked over. The lid was on the ground, and the contents were scattered. At first, I thought maybe a raccoon or some stray animal had gotten into it. That seemed reasonable. It was the countryside, after all. I cleaned it up and didn't think much more about it. That afternoon, the weather turned gray and colder. The wind came in stronger gusts, and clouds started rolling in. I decided to stay inside, make some food, and watch something on my laptop. The internet connection was slow, so I ended up just reading instead. Around 6 p.m., I noticed the lights in the main farmhouse were still off. I hadn't seen the host once since I arrived, and her car wasn't in the driveway. It was strange, but not necessarily alarming. Some hosts rented out their places and left town. When it got dark, the quiet started feeling heavier. The wind had died down, and the night air seemed completely still. I could hear small noises now and then, little creaks, the occasional tapping against the window. I told myself it was just branches or the structure settling. Around 10 p.m., I decided to shower before bed. The water pressure was weak, but warm enough. As I was drying off, I heard another noise outside, something like gravel crunching underfoot. It was faint but distinct, coming from somewhere near the side of the house. I froze for a moment, towel in hand, and listened. Came again, slower this time, then stopped completely. I turned off the bathroom light and went to the window, pulling the curtain back slightly. The yard was pitch black except for a dim porch light that barely reached a few feet beyond the steps. I couldn't see anything. The silence stretched on for what felt like minutes, and eventually, I went back to bed, telling myself it was probably just an animal again. I didn't sleep much that night. Every time I started to drift off, I'd hear some new sound, something shifting outside, or the faintest tap on the wall. Each time I tried to explain it away, but the unease kept building. By morning, I decided to go into town for a bit. I wanted to be around people, even if just for an hour. The nearest grocery store was about 15 minutes away. When I drove out, I looked back at the farmhouse. The curtains were still drawn, no movement inside. The place looked empty, almost abandoned. When I came back later that afternoon, something immediately felt wrong. The front door to the guest house was slightly open. Just a few inches, but enough to see the difference. I knew I had locked it when I left. My stomach dropped. I stood there for a few seconds, staring at it, trying to decide what to do. The wind wasn't strong enough to blow it open, and there was no sign of forced entry. I pushed it open slowly and stepped inside. Everything looked mostly the same, except the blanket on the couch was on the floor, and the window near the kitchen was cracked open a little. I checked the bedroom and bathroom, heart pounding, but there was no one there. Nothing seemed stolen. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been inside. That night, I kept every light on. I stayed awake longer than I meant to, sitting on the couch and listening to the faint sounds of the house. The wind had returned, brushing against the siding in slow, rhythmic waves. I finally went to bed around 1 a.m., still uneasy but too tired to stay awake. At some point in the middle of the night, I woke up again. It was dark except for the glow from the hallway light I'd left on. For a few seconds, I didn't know why I was awake. Then I heard it, a faint scraping sound coming from somewhere underneath the floorboards. It wasn't constant, just a short, dragging noise, then silence, then another. It was directly below the bedroom. I sat up, my pulse hammering in my ears, and listened for a long time. Eventually, it stopped. I didn't move until the sun came up. When it did, I went outside to check the area under the house. There was a crawl space door near the back, a small wooden hatch partly covered by overgrown grass. It was closed, but I noticed footprints in the dirt around it. Faint, uneven, like someone had been there recently. That was the last night I stayed. I packed everything up that morning, double-checked the locks, and left the key in the box. As I drove away, I looked back one last time. The farmhouse was still dark. The barn doors were slightly open again, and I caught a glimpse of something metallic glinting inside, like a tool or a ladder. Later, when I got home, I checked the property's reviews again. I hadn't noticed it before, but someone had left a short comment months earlier. Strange noises at night. Felt like someone was moving around under the floor. It was buried among all the positive reviews, easy to overlook. I thought about that sound, the slow dragging beneath the bedroom, and realized how close I might have been to whoever or whatever had been there. I never reported it. I didn't want to think about it anymore. But even now, when I hear the creak of a floorboard or the wind pressing against my walls, I remember that sound from under the house and the open door I hadn't noticed before. I'll never book a place that isolated again. I never imagined that our quiet getaway to upstate New York would end the way it did. My husband, Richard, and I had been married for nearly 47 years. We were supposed to spend that week celebrating the life we had built together, all the years that had gone by so quickly, the good and the bad. We didn't want to go anywhere far or fancy, just somewhere peaceful, somewhere surrounded by trees, quiet mornings, and that cool autumn air that we both loved. We found an Airbnb cabin outside a small town not far from the Catskills. The photos looked perfect. A small wooden cottage tucked between tall trees, a porch with rocking chairs, and a little fireplace inside. It seemed private, cozy, and simple, exactly the kind of place we'd always enjoyed. When we arrived, everything looked just like the listing. The driveway curved down a narrow gravel path, lined with leaves that had started to change color. The air smelled of pine and damp earth. The cabin stood back a bit from the road, with big oak and maple trees surrounding it. It felt almost secluded, which was comforting in a way. We unpacked slowly, enjoying the quiet. No city noise, no traffic, just the wind moving through the branches and the occasional sound of birds. Inside, the cabin was old but clean. It had that faint scent of wood smoke and age that reminded me of old vacation homes we'd stayed in years ago. The furniture was simple, worn-in, comfortable. There was a fireplace in the corner and a big front window that looked out toward the woods. Behind the cabin was a small clearing with a picnic table and an old fire pit made of stones. Richard walked around outside for a while, taking pictures of the trees and the leaves, while I unpacked some groceries and set up the kitchen. We spent the first 2 days relaxing. We'd drink coffee on the porch in the mornings and sit under a blanket in the evenings, watching the trees sway in the wind. It rained one night, and we listened to the sound of water hitting the roof, that steady rhythm that made us both sleepy. The air got cooler after that storm. The forecast mentioned a chance of more rain later in the week, maybe even strong winds, but it didn't seem like anything to worry about. The weather always changed fast up there. By the third morning, the wind had picked up. You could hear it pushing through the trees, a deep, constant rush that made the branches creak. The sky was gray and heavy, and the leaves that hadn't fallen yet were whipping around, a swirl of yellow and red. Richard went outside to check the car before we drove into town for groceries. When he came back, he said one of the big trees near the back of the cabin was swaying more than the others. He pointed it out through the window. It was a massive old oak, probably there long before the cabin was ever built. Its trunk was thick and dark, with deep cracks running along it. We stayed inside that day, mostly reading and keeping warm. The power flickered once or twice but held steady. The wind never really stopped, though. It just kept coming in waves. You could feel the whole cabin shift slightly at times, the kind of movement that made the windows rattle softly in their frames. I remember feeling uneasy but trying to brush it off. I told myself these old cabins were built to handle bad weather, and we'd be fine. That evening, the wind grew louder. I could hear the branches scraping against the roof and something thudding softly outside. Maybe a loose shutter or fallen branch. Richard went to throw another log in the fireplace, and we sat close, the firelight flickering against the walls. Around 9 p.m., the power finally went out. Everything went silent for a moment except for the wind. The firelight became the only light in the room. We didn't panic. We'd been through plenty of outages before. The storm outside just kept pushing harder. Sometime later, maybe an hour, we went to bed. The wind was still howling, but I started to drift off anyway. I woke up once to a loud cracking sound in the distance, like something heavy breaking apart. It echoed through the woods. I remember thinking it was probably just a branch falling. I listened for a bit longer, then fell back asleep. The next thing I remember was an enormous crash, like thunder right on top of us. The entire cabin shook violently, and before I could even react, the ceiling above us caved in. The sound was deafening. The splintering of wood, the shattering of glass, the rush of air and dust. I didn't even realize what had happened at first. The room filled with debris, darkness, and confusion. My first thought was to reach for Richard. I could hear the groan of wood still shifting, like something massive pressing down on the structure. When I tried to move, I felt pain shoot through my shoulder and leg. There was dust and insulation everywhere. I called out his name but couldn't hear him. It was too dark, and the air was thick with the smell of dirt and crushed wood. My side of the bed had been hit by debris, but somehow I wasn't trapped completely. I could see that a massive tree had come through the roof, its trunk splitting right through the middle of the cabin. Branches and pieces of ceiling filled the room. I tried to reach over, calling for him again, but there was no response. I crawled slowly through the wreckage, pulling myself toward the doorway, but my leg was weak, and I couldn't move easily. Every movement sent sharp pain through me. Outside, the wind was still raging, and the rain had started to fall again. The fire from the fireplace had gone out, leaving everything cold and dark. Eventually, I managed to make it out of the bedroom and to the front door, which had been forced open from the impact. I stepped outside and turned back, and that's when I saw the full damage. The giant oak had fallen straight onto the cabin, right across the roof. The trunk crushed the middle of it completely. The weight of it had splintered the walls and pushed the back half of the house nearly flat. I could see our bed through the wreckage, half covered in broken boards and branches. I tried again to go back, but there was no way in. The debris was too heavy, too dangerous. My body ached, and I could barely stand. I remember the cold wind hitting me, the rain soaking through my clothes. I could see the tree roots torn up from the ground, massive and tangled. It looked like it had been dead for a long time on the inside, hollow and rotted near the base. The storm must have been the last push that brought it down. It took hours before help arrived. A passing car had seen the damage from the road and called it in. The firefighters had to cut through the tree to reach the inside. I stood there in shock, wrapped in a blanket, unable to speak much. When they finally got inside, I already knew what they would find. Richard hadn't made it. The impact had been directly over his side of the bed. I remember sitting in the back of an ambulance, watching as they worked under the harsh lights, the rain still falling around them. I felt numb, like everything was happening in slow motion. The cabin that had felt so peaceful, so safe, was just gone. The smell of wet wood and earth hung in the air, mixed with smoke and gasoline from the rescue equipment. In the days after, the officials said it was an old tree weakened by rot, hidden beneath the bark. Probably would have come down soon no matter what, but the storm made it worse. The owner of the Airbnb was devastated when she came to the site. She said she'd never noticed anything wrong with that tree. It had been standing there for decades. I stayed in a nearby hotel after the hospital released me. My shoulder was bruised, my leg strained, but I was alive. I couldn't stop replaying the sound of that crash, the seconds between peace and chaos. I thought about how quickly life had changed, how a place meant for rest had turned into a nightmare. It's been years now, but I still can't sleep when the wind gets strong. That trip was supposed to be about celebrating 47 years together. Instead, it became the last memory I have of him. I sometimes think about how he loved the sound of the wind in the trees, how peaceful it made him feel. I can't listen to it anymore. For me, it will always sound like the moment everything fell apart. I still remember the way my stomach dropped when I opened the door to my apartment that day in Sydney. It was supposed to be a simple return home after a 10-day rental. Nothing unusual, just another guest who had booked through Airbnb like so many before. I had rented out my place dozens of times without any issue. My apartment sat on the third floor of a quiet building near Surrey Hills, a cozy one-bedroom space I had poured years of work and money into. I'd furnished it carefully, kept everything spotless, made sure guests always had clean towels, quality linens, and all the comforts that made it feel like a home rather than just a rental. When the booking came through, the profile looked normal. It was a man with a verified account, polite in his messages, saying he needed a place for 10 days while on business. His profile showed previous good reviews, nothing suspicious. I accepted without hesitation. He paid in full, checked in smoothly, and sent a quick note thanking me. For those 10 days, I didn't think much about it. Everything seemed routine. It was late on a Sunday afternoon when I went back to the apartment. I remember the air felt heavy that day, gray clouds hanging low over the city. I carried my small suitcase up the stairs, thinking about how good it would feel to get home and rest in my own bed again. But as soon as I reached my door, something felt off. The handle had a faint sticky residue on it, like it had been touched by oily hands. That was the first thing I noticed. The second was the smell. It hit me the moment I pushed the door open. Thick, chemical, and sour, mixed with something metallic that made my throat tighten. It was the kind of smell that doesn't belong in a home, something sharp and dirty that clings to everything. The air inside felt wrong. I stepped in slowly, my hands still on the doorframe, and what I saw didn't even register at first. The living room was completely destroyed. My rug, the expensive wool one I had bought from a small shop in Paddington, was soaked and stained dark in patches, the edges torn. The coffee table was tipped on its side. One leg snapped clean off. The couch cushions were slashed open, their stuffing pulled out and scattered across the floor like snow. Bottles, cans, ashtrays, and plastic bags were everywhere. I took a few steps forward, numb, looking around at the chaos. Every surface was covered with something. Burnt foil, syringes, little plastic tubes, scorched spoons, empty packets. There were cigarette burns on the arm of the couch, the kind that leave deep black circles. The walls were smudged with fingerprints and streaks of something that looked like soot. My framed photos were smashed. My bookshelf was half empty. The books I'd collected over the years tossed around or missing. I walked further in, and the smell grew worse, sharper, heavier. In the kitchen, the counter was covered in dirty dishes, most of them not mine. Someone had cooked something that had burned and been left to rot. The sink was full of black water. The floor was sticky, and when I stepped on it, it made a faint pulling sound. My hands were shaking. Then I went toward the bedroom, and that's when I saw it. The bed was stripped bare, the sheets gone. My towels, the white ones I'd folded neatly in the closet before leaving, were on the floor, soaked in dark stains that I knew instantly were blood. Not just small spots, large smears and soaked patches that had dried into the fabric. The sight made me freeze completely. I couldn't tell what had happened, but the image burned itself into my mind. It didn't look like a simple injury or accident. It looked violent. The dresser drawers were all pulled out and emptied. My jewelry box was open, nearly everything gone. The small safe I kept under the bed had been pried open. Inside, where I usually kept spare cash and a few documents, there was nothing but broken hinges. My laptop was gone. The TV had been ripped off the wall, cables dangling like torn veins. My camera, my watch, even some clothes were missing. It was like someone had lived a completely different life in that apartment for those 10 days. A chaotic, destructive existence that left nothing untouched. I remember standing in the middle of the room, trying to piece it all together, but my mind couldn't keep up. The silence inside the apartment felt heavy and wrong. Every creak and sound from outside made me flinch. I could still smell the chemical odor mixed with the sharpness of blood and burnt material. When I stepped into the bathroom, the damage only got worse. The mirror was cracked. The tiles were smeared with something dark and greasy. The towels were piled in the corner, stained and stiff. My toiletries were scattered across the sink, some broken open. The shower curtain had been ripped halfway down, and there were cigarette burns along the edge of the sink. The whole place looked less like someone had rented it and more like it had been taken over by something uncontrolled, something desperate. I could almost picture the nights that must have happened there. The loud music, the shouting, the crashing, the smell of drugs burning. Maybe people coming and going at all hours, strangers who had no idea whose home it was. It wasn't hard to imagine the chaos that must have taken place in those 10 days. I called the police and they came within an hour. They walked through the apartment quietly, taking pictures, making notes. They told me they'd seen this kind of thing before, Airbnb rentals used for drug binges or parties that spiral out of control. They said it could have been a group using a fake profile, or someone who rented it legitimately and then invited others in. Either way, they were gone now. The investigation didn't turn up much. The guest's account had been deleted. The contact number he'd used was disconnected. The name on the ID he uploaded didn't match any real person. Airbnb cooperated with the police, but there wasn't much they could do. It was a fake identity tied to stolen information. Whoever did it had planned it that way. I spent the next few weeks cleaning, replacing, and repairing everything. The rugs were ruined beyond saving. The couch had to be thrown out. I repainted the walls, replaced the furniture, replaced the locks. Even after everything was spotless again, the smell lingered for weeks. Faint but always there, a mix of smoke and rot that clung to the air. I could never get it completely out. Every time I thought it was gone, it would drift back on humid days, reminding me. The cost of the damage came to over $10,000. Airbnb covered some of it through their host guarantee, but it didn't feel like enough. The money didn't erase what had happened. It didn't take away that memory of standing in my own home, surrounded by filth and destruction, realizing that strangers had done things there I could never fully imagine. I stopped renting it out after that. Couldn't. The thought of handing over my keys to another stranger made my skin crawl. The apartment didn't feel like mine anymore. Even after I replaced everything, it still felt tainted, like the walls themselves had absorbed something rotten. It took me almost a year to feel comfortable living there again. For a long time, I'd wake up at night thinking I heard footsteps or voices, even though I knew it was just my mind replaying the chaos I never actually saw. I never found out who did it or what really happened during those 10 days. The police eventually closed the case, labeling it as property vandalism and theft, nothing more. But every time I think about it, I picture that first moment. The smell, the sticky floor, the blood-soaked towels. It wasn't just about the money or the repairs. It was the realization that for 10 days, my home had been something else entirely, a place of violence, addiction, and destruction. I had rented it out thinking it would be used for rest, for comfort, for normal life. Instead, it became a space for something dark, something that left its mark on every inch of it. Now, whenever I see a listing online or pass a building filled with short-term rentals, I think about how easily trust can be broken, how easy it is to hand your life, your space, and your sense of safety over to someone you don't really know. I still live in that apartment today, but there are moments when I catch a faint trace of that old smell in the air, and for a second, it feels like it's all still there, hidden under the surface, waiting. I'll never forget the smell that hit me that morning when I went back to check on the cabin. It was one of those thick, sour smells that clings to the back of your throat and refuses to fade no matter how long you stand there trying to breathe through your mouth. I had rented out that cabin dozens of times before, tucked deep in the woods of northern Georgia, quiet and secluded, the kind of place people book to get away from everything. It was small but comfortable, built on raised wooden beams with a deck that overlooked a thick stretch of forest. Most guests came for the peace and quiet, to sit on the porch and listen to the crickets at night. That weekend had been booked by a young couple. They checked out early on a Sunday morning, sending a short message saying the stay was great and they'd left everything clean. I didn't think much of it. Usually, I gave the place a day or two before going up to clean and reset it. But that Monday, I got a message from the next guest saying they couldn't check in because something smelled off around the property. I figured maybe a raccoon had died nearby, or maybe food had been left in the trash. Things like that happen sometimes out there. When I drove up that afternoon, everything looked normal from the outside. The cabin sat at the end of a gravel path, surrounded by tall pines and oak trees. The air was still and heavy, the kind of quiet that made the woods feel hollow. But even before I reached the porch, I could smell it. It wasn't faint. It was strong, a deep, rotten stench that hit in waves, the kind of smell that made your stomach twist immediately. I opened the door, half expecting to see a pile of trash left behind or maybe some spoiled food in the kitchen, but the inside looked fine. Everything was neat. The bed was made, dishes were washed, nothing seemed out of place. But the smell was stronger inside, thicker. It didn't smell like food or garbage. It smelled like something dead. I went from room to room, checking corners, behind furniture, under the bed, in the closet. Nothing. The smell was strongest near the living room, by the fireplace, and it seemed to be coming from below. The cabin was built a couple of feet off the ground because the land sloped slightly downhill behind it. There was a crawl space under the deck that you could access from the side. I'd never had to go under there before, but I figured maybe some animal had crawled in and died. It wasn't unusual for a possum or a raccoon to get trapped. I went out to the truck, grabbed a flashlight, and crouched down beside the deck. The air underneath was cool, but the closer I got, the worse the smell became. It was so bad that I had to cover my mouth with my shirt. I shined the flashlight into the dark space under the cabin, and at first, all I saw were dirt and old leaves. Then the light caught something pale and oddly shaped. I thought it was a bag or a pile of debris. When I crawled a little closer, I realized it was the body of a deer. I froze. It was bloated and darkened, clearly dead for a while. The fur was matted, flies buzzing all around it. The smell was overpowering now, hitting in waves so thick I could barely breathe. Then I saw another shape beside it, and another. I moved the light slowly and counted. 6 deer. 6 dead deer, all packed tightly under the cabin, some lying half on top of the others. The dirt around them was soaked, and the wood beams above were stained dark in patches. My first thought was that maybe they'd gotten trapped under there somehow, maybe chased by something. But the way they were arranged didn't look natural. They were too close together, like they'd been dragged there on purpose. I backed out slowly, my stomach turning. Outside, the air felt cleaner, but the smell still clung to me. I stood there trying to make sense of it. There was no way 6 deer had crawled under there and died by accident. Someone had to have put them there. The only people who'd been at the cabin recently were that couple. I walked around the back of the cabin, trying to see if there were any signs of digging or tracks. The ground was hard, packed with pine needles and dirt, but near the access point, there were drag marks. Long, uneven grooves leading from the woods toward the crawl space. It looked like something heavy had been pulled across the ground several times. My mind was racing. Why would someone do that? The more I thought about it, the more unsettling it felt. Those deer hadn't been there long, maybe a week at most, judging by the state of decay, which meant they'd been placed there while the last guests were staying. I started to replay the details in my head, the short message they'd sent, how they'd left early, how polite they'd sounded in their texts. Nothing had seemed strange at the time, but now it all felt wrong. I called animal control first and then local authorities. Took hours before anyone came out. By then, the smell had spread through the whole property. When the officers arrived, they took one look under the cabin and immediately called for backup. They confirmed it: 6 deer, all dead, all intentionally placed. From the condition of the bodies, it looked like they'd been shot somewhere else and dragged there afterward. Whoever did it had taken time and effort to shove them under the floorboards. The officers asked about the last guests. I gave them all the information: names, dates, contact numbers. They told me they'd investigate, but even as they said it, I could tell they were confused by it too. It wasn't normal. It wasn't something people just did. There wasn't any sign of ritual or symbols or anything like that. Just raw, deliberate cruelty. The cleanup took days. Animal control removed the carcasses, disinfected the crawl space, and sealed the access point. Even after everything was gone, the smell lingered, faint but always there. I had to leave the windows open for weeks, running fans constantly, trying to clear it out. It got into the wood, the carpets, everything. I couldn't rent the cabin again for months. I couldn't stop thinking about that couple. They'd seemed normal from the little I knew of them. Their messages polite, their profile full of smiling photos. Nothing about them stood out. But somewhere in those 3 days they spent there, they had killed or found those deer and decided to drag them under my cabin. Maybe it was some twisted prank, maybe a strange obsession, or maybe something darker. The police never found enough evidence to charge anyone. The guests stopped responding to messages. Airbnb removed their account eventually, but it didn't change much. Even after everything was cleaned and the smell finally faded, I never felt the same about that place. Every time I walked around the cabin, I'd look toward that crawl space and imagine those lifeless bodies stacked in the dark. Sometimes, when the wind shifted just right, I swore I could still smell it. Faint, like a memory the woods refused to let go of. I ended up selling the property a year later. I told the new owner that the cabin had some wildlife issues, but I didn't tell them the details. I couldn't bring myself to. That place had felt peaceful once, like an escape. But after that, it just felt tainted, not haunted, not cursed, just permanently stained by something awful that no one could explain. I've managed other rentals since then, in different towns, different states, but I've never forgotten that cabin in the woods. Sometimes when I get a message from new guests, polite, cheerful, telling me how excited they are to stay, I still think about that couple, how normal they seemed, how easy it was to let them in, how you can never really know what someone might do when you're not around. That cabin taught me something I never wanted to learn, that evil doesn't always come with a reason. Sometimes it's just there, quiet and deliberate, hiding under the floorboards, waiting for someone to find it.